Hey everyone, my name is Justin, and iOS 16 is Apple's next generation of their iPhone operating system, and I've been using it for a couple of months now. So here's everything new that you need to know so you're ready for the update once it goes live to your iPhone in the fall. So there's a lot of new stuff coming to iOS 16, some major, some minor, but I think the really big thing here is a complete update to the lock screen. We probably don't think about it much, but the lock screen is one of the parts of our phones that we look at the most. Every time we pick our phones up, the first thing we see is always the lock screen. It's already helpful enough with the time and notifications in iOS 15, but Apple's making it even more functional, personal, and beautiful in iOS 16. There's a bunch of new ways to personalize your lock screen, from being able to change the font and color of the time to adding widgets. When you first look at the iOS 16 lock screen, the biggest change you'll probably see is the new default font for the time. It's a bit bigger and a lot bolder than the font on iOS 15, so it's easier to see and looks a lot better, in my opinion. If you don't agree with that though, no worries, because there are now new font choices to choose from for your lock screen. To start customizing everything, you just tap and hold on the lock screen, just like on an Apple Watch, and you can tap into your current wallpaper to start making changes. So if you tap on the time, you've got all these options here for your font, as well as the color here at the bottom. Now iOS will automatically choose a color that will contrast and be easy to read on top of your wallpaper, but you can always choose your own. So now that you've got your time sorted out, what about the stuff above it? Now, personally, I really prefer having the date up there above the time, because anything else just kind of seems out of place and chaotic to me for some reason. But you do have the option now, and maybe something will interest you. So for example, you can change the date to become a description of the upcoming events in your calendar or your activity metrics for the day if you own an Apple Watch. Again, I prefer the date, but if you'd prefer something else, you do have the opportunity to customize that. One feature that I find pretty interesting too is support for widgets on the lock screen. They kind of have elements from the Apple Watch again, with these small squares and rectangles with rounded corners that look like watch complications, but just scaled up for the iPhone. So these are basically mini versions of the widgets in the Today view and on the home screen, and they offer quick, glanceable information for stuff like the weather, battery of your devices, and even your activity rings if you own an Apple Watch. So there's a lot of freedom here to customize whatever information you want to be able to see on your lock screen with a quick glance. And all of these elements, the date, time, and widgets, are all the same color to match. I mentioned earlier that the new lock screen was more functional, but I also mentioned that it was more beautiful as well. And in iOS 16, Apple's made some changes to make your lock screen look great. First of all, there's this really cool new depth effects feature, which, when it works, looks great. You can already see it working here with the default wallpaper for iOS 16, with a bit of the time getting covered by whatever that is in the wallpaper. Other than the default wallpaper, this effect works really well with images that have a clear subject. Right now, the stuff that seems to work with the depth detection are subjects like people, pets, landscapes, and some buildings. One thing that is a little strange is that once you turn on widgets, depth detection is disabled and you can't use it. I'm not sure why that wouldn't work with widgets on, because then you could just have the widgets be cut off by the elements in the wallpaper, but that is something to take note of. So you kind of have to make the choice between wanting widgets on your lock screen or having depth detection work with your time. The lock screen does display more information than just the date, time, and widgets, and that is of course your notifications. Traditionally, they kind of just appear and stack near the middle of the screen, and as more start to collect, they end up covering up the picture. To make your wallpaper more pronounced and feel like it's really part of your lock screen, notifications have a new way of showing up to stop them from covering it. They'll now roll up from the bottom of the screen to avoid blocking anything, and if more show up, they'll kind of just trail off until you scroll up to reveal them. You can also customize how they behave in settings with 3 different options. So they have count, stack, and list, and there are small graphics that help you see how each mode behaves. In count mode, you won't see the notifications on the lock screen, except for a bit of small text at the bottom that tells you how many notifications you have. When you tap on the text or scroll up from the bottom of the screen, you reveal all of the notifications you have, and they start rolling up from where they trail off. Now in stack mode, it's basically the same thing as count, but without the little bit of text at the bottom with the number of notifications you have. Instead, all of your notifications aren't hidden and remain on your lock screen, but they do kind of stay near at the bottom and trail off if there are more. Now, I wasn't able to get the list mode to work, but by the looks of things, it'll display notifications like in iOS 15, where they begin from the middle of the lock screen and start to cover up the display picture. And you can link each lock screen you have with a focus. So for example, this one is set to work, and I have another one which is just set to nothing. And I have the work focus turned on, so it'll automatically switch to this lock screen and wallpaper on my home screen. And this feature works together with something from iOS 15, which allows you to set specific home screen pages you want to show during a specific focus mode. So I could have the work focus mode show this lock screen and only the first few pages of my home screen. And then when I turn off the work focus, it'll switch the wallpaper back to the one I had set before, and my lock screen will return to normal. Apple is also adding a new feature called Live Events, which is kind of like a home screen widget at the bottom of your lock screen, but it updates live. It's not going to get support by apps immediately when iOS 16 releases in the fall, but it is coming. So it basically displays live information in the lock screen, with stuff like the music you're playing, the timer you have set, and once apps begin to support it, stuff like your workout information, food orders, and scores of sports games with play-by-play information. It looks pretty helpful, so hopefully we'll have support for that soon. But that's everything new with the lock screen, and I think Apple has made some great improvements in making the lock screen look better and feel more personal. And yeah, this is probably the biggest thing in iOS 16, and I think once iOS 16 goes live, we're gonna have a lot of people customizing their lock screens and showing off what they've done. There are a lot of cool features in iOS that use machine learning, like Dictation to use your voice to type. In iOS 16, Dictation gets this cool new update where you can actually use both your voice and the keyboard to type. So unlike in iOS 15 where Dictation just takes control of the whole keyboard, you can actually use your voice to type and then continue on the screen. So you can even highlight words and then replace them using your voice. Now, there's this feature called Live Text that was introduced last year, and if you're not familiar with it, it basically scans your photos and stuff in your camera for any text, and if it detects any, you'll be able to highlight it to copy and paste, or see quick results like unit conversions if something in the image contains measurements. Now in iOS 16, Apple is bringing this feature to video, so you can pause a video on any frame and be able to use live text functions like normal. And similar to live text, there's a brand new feature in iOS 16 that uses machine learning to let you select the subject in any photo and separate it from the rest of the image just like that. It only takes like half a second, and then you've got this pretty well-cut, transparent image of the subject in your photo. Most of the time, this feature works pretty well. It can identify a subject pretty quickly, and then it can immediately separate it from the background for you. So this will work the best with images that have absolute clear differentiation between the subject and the background, like if there are contrasting colors between the foreground and the background. But in general, this feature is pretty smart and can separate the subject without having extremely clear clues as to what the foreground is. Once you've got your cutout, you can drag and drop it into any app that takes photos and you can send it or save it somewhere. And while we're here in Messages, let's actually go over the new changes Apple's made to the Messages app. There are 3 big changes here, the first one being, finally, the ability to edit your messages that you've sent. There is a time limit though. You have 15 minutes from once you've sent your message to make an edit to it. So if you've made a typo or you come back to the message and you see that something's wrong, you can just tap and hold on it, select edit, change the message, and once you're done, it'll update on the recipient's device. And on top of editing messages, you can now undo send a message up to 4 minutes after initially sending it. So if you send something that you absolutely regret, you now have the opportunity in iOS 16 to completely delete it off the face of the earth. There is a little note here that does say that the person you're messaging needs to be on iOS 16 or later for this feature to work. So if you're messaging someone who hasn't updated yet, whenever you edit or delete a message, it won't update on their phone. So do make sure that you're being careful when you're using these features. And there is one more new feature that is long overdue. You can finally mark messages as unread so you can come back to them later. I'm not sure how long other messaging apps have had this feature and how stupidly long it took Apple to add it, but after all that time, it's finally here. That's pretty much all the big stuff in iOS 16, but what I love about these major updates is that they also include a ton of minor features that, when you put them together, still make a huge difference in the experience. Like how we finally have haptic feedback in the keyboard now. Previously, you had to use third-party keyboard apps like Grammarly to do this, but now there's a stock option in the settings app for sounds and haptics. You can't see it or hear it, but every time I press a key, I get a light tap from the phone, instead of a buzz that can be overpowering on some other phones. I like how Spotlight Search has been given a new UI refresh, and how when you idle on the home screen, you're reminded that it actually exists. I do use Spotlight a lot myself for apps that aren't on my home screen, so I really appreciate the refresh. I also like how iOS 16 borrows the expandable information cards from the new weather app on iPadOS 16. So now when you tap on, for example, a date in the 10-day weather forecast, you can see hour-by-hour information and scroll through it. From stuff like the personalization features in the lock screen to the ability to unsend iMessages, I think this is a solid update to iOS, and I'm really excited for its release in the fall when you can all get your hands on it. Thanks for watching, I'm Justin, and I'll see you in the next video.